Hey, Pastor Mike here, and God bless you guys. I'm glad you're tuning in today. We have a special guest today for the Passover to explain to you all about the Passover. Great teaching, and it's a friend of ours, formerly a chaplain outside of the Sacramento area, and he's going to explain to you all about. His name's Jacob Cohen. So, Jacob, go ahead and share with us. God bless you guys.
You walk into a movie theater. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Jacob Cohen. How are you doing? You walk into a movie theater late, maybe 5 minutes late after the movie has started, and hey, you can kind of get an idea of what's going on, who's chasing who the bad guy is, who the good guy is. So you watch it, and you can kind of keep up with it. And then maybe if you stay for the rest of the, you stay for the first 10 minutes of the movie that you missed, and that certain vagueness is kind of filled in. You know, the Bible is annoying in that way, and I could say that in Holy Week without getting thunder, lightning come down on me. The Bible is annoying that way because it assumes that you know exactly what's in it backwards and forwards from the beginning to the end. And it presents every verse, it presents as if you know what it's talking about from the beginning to the end. And what I want to do today is give you a little bit of background on the Last Supper and focus on the roots of the communion service. Now, most Christians, I would say, are familiar that they know that the communion service was given during a Passover night, right? So they're familiar with that. So what I want to do is I want to rein this in and bring it back down to what happened that night and what went on. A little bit more specifics. Now, Colossians says, so let no one judge you in regard to food and drink, or in regard to a festival, a new moon celebration, a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the reality, however, is found in the Messiah, in Christ, in Jesus, right? The immediate purpose of these holidays found in Leviticus chapter 23 is that they are prescribed as a memorial for the Exodus and the events that followed. In other words, they look back in celebration to what God has done, but they also serve as a shadow, as we see in this verse, a shadow or a type of different aspects of the Messiah's first and second advent. So they look back at the Passover Exodus, and they look ahead, they look forward to the first and second advent of the Messiah. So now when Jesus and the disciples sat down for that Last Supper night, the mindset of the disciples was on the celebration, the Exodus Passover. Jesus knew what was going to happen. Jesus knew that what his fate was. He had to fulfill these scriptures that he's going to be suffering and dying for the people's sins, everyone's sins. He knew the role of being a Passover lamb, but they were not. The disciples didn't know it. And later on, when they look back on the rituals of the Passover, they realized the significance of what was happening then. But at the time, when they were sitting during that Passover Seder, they did not know. They didn't understand. So the disciples were focusing on the grand story of the Exodus, and they weren't aware that the old covenant of the Torah was about to be fulfilled and the new covenant was about to be instituted. So we start off with the story of the Passover, and that's what the Feast of the Passover celebrates, the Exodus of the Passover. You're all familiar with the Passover, how it's really interesting because if you open up to the last book of Genesis, we find this extended family of Israel living in Egypt. And if you turn one page, now 400 years have gone by, one page, and you find the Israelites, and now this extended family was incubated. God used that time to incubate the extended family of Israel into the nation of Israel, from the time of Joseph till the time of Moses, right? So the Jewish people became so numerous in Egypt that the Egyptians felt threatened, and so they enslaved them at a certain point of their history. And so now we have Israel is residing as slaves in Egypt. And God raises up Moses, and God sends 10 plagues Egypt's way to force the Egyptians to release the Israelites. We know the story. Pharaoh did not see things God's way, and so he kept his heart kept on hardening his own heart, and so he kept the Israelites as slaves. And it took 9 plagues, and now we're on the 10th plague. And the 10th plague, Moses instructs the people of Israel to slay a lamb and put the blood of the lamb on a doorpost. And God says he's going to go through the land of Egypt. He's going to take the lives of the Egyptian firstborn. And when he sees the blood of the lamb on the doorpost of the Hebrew home, he's going to pass over that home. That's how Passover got its name. We're a simple people. When I see the blood, I'm going to pass over the home. So Passover. So Passover is a story of redemption of a people from slavery into freedom. And Passover also serves as a type or a shadow of the death of the Messiah. In 1 Corinthians 5:7, it says, "For Christ our Passover has been sacrificed." So Passover is not just a type of the death of the Messiah, which it is, but it's the type of death that the Messiah was supposed to undergo, which was crucifixion. We'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, freedom in the Bible is not simply described as a concept, but it happened in real time and space. And what this celebration of the Passover does is it's a celebration of the events of the Exodus and the events that followed. And it's practiced in many Jewish homes to this day. So this is where we find the roots of our communion service in this very Last Supper Passover meal. It was not haphazard. It was very purposefully and deliberately filled with the very symbolism which was predestined to be fulfilled by the Messiah, Jesus, our Passover. So again, the concept of freedom was not some kind of just a philosophical concept. It was real slaves in a real nation in real time and space, and that's why this Christ our Passover translates so well into our spiritual redemption, which is what it's going to be pointing to. So there's a parallel here. Now, the Passover order of service, and that's what Seder means. The word Seder means order of service, has a defined order to it. There are many rituals which take place in various forms that are practiced even to this day. And we find these rituals taking place during the Last Supper Passover, that Passover meal. So the Passover celebration, first of all, revolves around 4 cups of wine. In other words, each participant gets 1 cup of wine. It's set in front of you, and it's refilled 4 times during the Passover. And each of these cups represent one of the I wills verses found in Exodus 6, 6, and 7. So each of these cups has a name, and it focuses on different aspects of the Exodus. So the first cup that you partake of is called the cup of sanctification. It represents the first I will verse in Exodus 6, 6. It represents sanctification or separation. So the separation of Israel. I will redeem you, I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. That's the first Passover cup we partake of. The second cup is called the cup of judgment or the cup of plagues. This cup represents the second I will free you from being slaves to them. The third cup is designated the cup of redemption. This cup represents the blood of the lamb that was placed on the doorposts of the Hebrew slave's home. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with many acts of judgment. Remember how God said he would pass through the land of Egypt. He was going to pass over those doors that had the blood of the lamb. Well, this is what that represents, the blood that was used to put in the doorposts when God redeemed Israel. The fourth cup is called the cup of Hallel, or the cup of praise. It represents the fourth I will found in Exodus 6, 7. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Hallel means praise, so like hallelujah. So it's the cup of praise. I will take you to my own people, and I will be your God. So that's the fourth cup that's mentioned in Exodus 6, 6, and 7. The New Testament mentions the first cup, and it mentions the third cup. It does not mention the second and the fourth cup, just to give you an idea. Now, the bread that's used for Passover, these are loaves of matzah. I'm going to pick this up and show them to you. I'm sure you've seen it. It's a big cracker. It's just bread without leaven. Can you see that? Bread without leaven. Can't miss it. And it would be on the Passover table. Now, those loaves are simply made without leaven. That's all they are. And the reason we do this is because we use these loaves of unleavened bread because leavening, yeast or leaven takes time for dough to rise. And the Israelites were told to make these loaves without leaven because there was no time for the dough to rise. And so, because you were supposed to be ready at a moment's notice. So that's why you wind up with unleavened bread during the Passover. And while the Old Testament was still being written, leaven began being used in the Old Testament as a symbol of sin. And it's an accurate symbol of sin because leavening is a corrupting agent. That's what it does. And so in that sense, it's kind of a natural symbol because it's a corrupting agent. And so it became symbolically used as a symbol of sin. And the New Testament really runs with this. Beware of the leaven of the Herodians, the leaven of the Pharisees. Again, meaning beware of their corrupt teaching or sinful teaching or something like that. So now during a regular Passover service, at a certain point of time, the head of the table, and to this day this happens, breaks the unleavened bread and gives it and distributes it to each member of the table. And And now this is used in the context of the Passover Seder. It's used exclusively to remember that the Israelites had to be ready to leave at a moment's notice. But something interesting happens when we get into the New Testament. Now, up to this day, if you were in a Jewish home, there's a place on the table where these 3 loaves of unleavened matzah are placed. And they're placed one on top of the other. And there's a little ritual that takes place I'm not going to get into. If you ever want to, you can write to me or give me a buzz and I can talk about it. But there's a certain place, until Christ's day and before the Messiah's day, there were 3 loaves of leaven placed on the table, specifically 3. I have them here again. 3 loaves of leaven. And what would happen is you would leave the first one alone and the third one alone, and you were supposed to take the middle loaf of leaven that's on the table, and you would distribute that one at a certain point of the evening. Now, the rabbis called these 3 loaves, which were in one compartment or in one napkin, on a plate, on a napkin. In Jesus' time, they would have done it that way. So 3 loaves on one plate with a napkin on top. And Rabbi said that these 3 loaves are called the one. And the question is, now everything in the Passover is explained extensively, but this is not explained too extensively. Why the 3 called the one? And some rabbis said, well, each of these matzahs represent respectively, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Other rabbis talked about how the matzahs represent, one represents the people, and the other represents the priesthood, and the other represents God. So that's another explanation. We Hebrew Christians, we Jews who believe that Jesus is the true Jewish Messiah, we believe that these 3 are called the one because it represents the triunity of the one God. So God, there's only one God, but he's in 3 persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And the 3 are one, like a unified one. Now, the name for these 3 matzahs is called the echad. There's 2 words in Hebrew for the word one. One is echad, the word I just used, and then the other one is yachid. Just to give you an idea, the difference, they sound the same, but they're not. They're different words. And to give you an idea, the difference is that the word echad, that first word I mentioned, may be used as a composite one. For example, when a man, remember in Genesis, it says that the 2 will become one flesh. Adam and Eve will become one flesh. Basar echad. You have 2 distinct persons, Adam and Eve. Not one person, 2 persons, but the 2 are one flesh. So that's the word that's used, echad, basar echad. There's another word in Hebrew, and that's yachid. It sounds similar. It's used for the word one. But the difference is that word is only used as a solitary one. So when God told Abraham, take your son, your one son, meaning he's the only son as far as the promise is concerned. Ishmael was alive at that time. That's not the son of the promise. Your only son, or your solitary son, Isaac, he's the one that was given these promises. The Abrahamic promises goes to Isaac, to Abraham, then Isaac, and then Jacob. So take your one son, your solitary son. Now these are called the one, and they're called the unity one because we Hebrew believers in Jesus believe that the 3 matzahs represent the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And when we come to the communion, you'll see it'll kind of make more sense. By the way, the words in Hebrew, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Which word is used for one? Echad. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Again, it doesn't prove a trinity, but it opens up the possibility. If God wanted to make sure that everybody knew he's an absolute solitary one, then he had the word Yachid, and he didn't use that. He used the word Echad. And you can see this angel of the Lord throughout scriptures, who is called God, also calls himself God, and is worshipped. Okay. In a regular Passover Seder with slight variation, the middle loaf of matzah is taken out, not the first loaf, not the third loaf, but specifically the second loaf, the middle loaf, and it's distributed to each participant. It's prayed over and then it's eaten. And again, why the middle loaf and not the first and third? Removing the middle matzah represents the incarnation, the middle person of the Trinity, when the Messiah, the Son, left heaven and was born as a man. And breaking this piece, so you take it out, you break it, and this signifies the death of the Messiah, and we distribute it. Now, the Jewish Passover, if you went to a Jewish Passover that does not believe, as I do, that Jesus is the Messiah, they don't look at the breaking of the bread of matzah as having any significance to the Trinity or the death of the Messiah. So understand that. I'm giving this to you from a Jewish believing, Jesus believing perspective. But so this tradition was already in place when Jesus was doing this ritual. It was the middle matzah he would have been taken out. And then we find that in Luke 22:19, it says, when he had taken some bread and given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Now, in order for bread to be kosher, for the matzah to be kosher for Passover, it has to be first unleavened. Remember, leaven represents sin. Jesus' body was sinless, so that's why he's using matzah. Also, you could see the stripes here, and you could see that it's pierced. You may not be able to see, but you can see the light through, and it's pierced. So as we know, Jesus' body was striped by the Roman whips, and it was pierced by Roman spears and by crucifixion also. So now this middle piece of matzah that we would have taken out has a name, and the name is afikomen. The word afikomen is not a Hebrew word, it's a Greek word actually, and it means that which comes last, or dessert. And the idea is it's the last piece of food you're supposed to eat at the Passover table. That's why it's called that which comes last, or dessert. But it has, the word afikomen in Greek has another meaning, and it also means, I have already come. I have already come. So when Jewish people proclaim this or do this ritual throughout Passover, and they all proclaim this, what they're really doing is they're proclaiming the gospel, but they don't know. They have no idea. And certain little rituals were put into this where Jewish people are doing this. They were put in by Hebrew Christians in the first century, actually. So, but this ritual of taking out the middle piece of matzah and giving it, that was already part of the Passover beforehand. Now, Paul writes, your boasting is not good. Don't you know the little yeast works through the whole batch of dough? Get rid of the old yeast that you may be a new batch without yeast as you really are. For the Messiah, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the festival, not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and wickedness, but with bread without yeast, the bread of sincerity and truth. Since Messiah, our Passover lamb, is sinless, we should purge the leaven, the sin out of our lives also as a time of reflection. So he took that middle piece of matzah, he distributed, gave it to the people, to the disciples at the table, and now we come to the third cup of wine. The third cup, remember, symbolizes in the Passover the blood of the Passover lamb that was placed on the doors. And the third cup of wine is partaken of after the supper. And this particular cup represents, again, the blood of the lamb that was placed on the Israelite doors. It's called the cup of redemption. It's that third I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. And this is Exodus 6:6. So this cup represents the blood that was placed in the door. And look what Jesus does. Luke 22, he takes the same cup. It says in the same way, he took the cup after they had eaten, that's where it comes. The third cup comes right after you eat dinner. And this cup, he says, which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. So again, you can see the symbolism behind the Lord's table. The first communion, Jesus didn't just take any bread. He didn't take Wonder Bread, right? He took Passover, unleavened bread, the matzah. It symbolizes his own sinlessness. And not from any old place, but he took it from that middle, he took the middle piece. Out of the three, he took the middle piece, that second piece, which signifies the second person of the triunity in his incarnation and his death. And in the same way, Jesus just didn't take any cup of wine. It was very specific to the Passover, the third cup in the Passover, not the first and not the fourth, which represented the blood of the Passover lamb. And he used that to symbolize his own death on the cross. Now, it's kind of interesting because when I was a kid, we would go through these Passovers and I would think, well, this is really strange because if you actually look at Exodus 12, 21 through 23, Exodus 12, 21 through 23, my Bible is not cooperating with me. All right. And now my eyes are not cooperating with me. We'll get there. All right, here. Then Moses summoned all the Israelites and the elders and said to them, go at once and select an animal for your families and slaughter the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop, dip it into the blood in the basin, and put some of the blood on top and both sides of the door frame. Not one of you shall go out of the door until morning. Now, here's the thing. This is kind of interesting because in the Hebrew it actually says you're supposed to take some hyssop. Now, picture it. So slay the lamb, and the lamb's blood goes to the bottom of there's a built-in basin in these thresholds. The lamb's blood gathers there. It's used for cleaning. It's a dirty place, Egypt. So think of the dust. So they used it's a very shallow basin. And so you're supposed to take the blood, which it has rather, the threshold with this built-in basin has blood gathered into it now, because you let the blood of the lamb gather there. You're supposed to take some hyssop. Now in Hebrew it says this. It says you dip the hyssop into the blood, into that threshold, the basin, and you're supposed to, in Hebrew, here it said put the blood. In Hebrew the word is to touch or strike the top and the two side posts. The sign of Israel's redemption was there's blood on the bottom in that basin that's gathered. Now there's blood on the top and then the two side posts. When I was a kid, I would think to myself, wait a minute, what is that all about? The sign of Israel's redemption imitates the sign of a cross. Now, I don't want you thinking, Moses did not know about crucifixion. Crucifixion hadn't even been invented yet. And Roman crucifixion was even more specific, and it hadn't been invented way later. But the sign, so he didn't know that the Messiah was going to come and die for us on a cross. But God knew. So all he knew was to tell the Israelites to put the pattern of blood was such a pattern. You had blood on the bottom, blood on top, and blood on the two signposts. And it looked like when I was a kid, I was like, hey, this looks like a cross. I knew that Jesus had, normally if you're crucified, your head doesn't necessarily bleed, but Jesus had the thorns put on his head. So his head would have been bleeding, and his arms, of course, and his feet were together as well. So it's not simply the Passover is not simply Christ our Passover. It's not simply or merely the death of the Messiah. It's also represents, or it's a shadow of the manner of his death as well. So that's the Passover. God knew that the lamb, that Jesus was going to be slain since the foundations of the earth. That was his plan from eternity to eternity. So it's not something that threw him off. But Moses didn't know, is my main point. But this is the kind of things I used to see when I was a kid in the Passover in different areas in the Old Testament. So thank you. I appreciate your time, and God bless you.